Good morning. I think we're going to try to get started because we're a few minutes past. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jennifer Nesbitt. I am the development coordinator for the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy, and I'm here at the Lake Conference helping to represent the Conservancy. It's also my pleasure to introduce Robert Johnson, and we'll do some questions after his talk, just like we did for our introductory talk. So if you have a note card with a question, just pick it up and give me a little wave, or if you need one, just let me know while Mr. Johnson is speaking. Robert Johnson is the owner of Racine-Johnson Aquatic Ecologists, and he works throughout New York on our lakes, primarily focused on aquatic plant equality and plant growth management. He is retired from a 40-year career at Cornell University, where he researched aquatic plants and managed the Cornell University Research Ponds. He has a courtesy appointment now to Cornell's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and he's also the lead scientist for New York State's efforts to control the spread, or to stop the spread of the growth of the aquatic plant invasive Hydrilla verticillata, which was discovered in October of 2011 in Cayuga Inlet and in southern Cayuga Lake in Ithaca. Throughout Mr. Johnson's career, he has provided aquatic lake management information to New York residents, lakes associations, lakes professionals, and government officials. His expertise focuses on the importance of aquatic plant communities on lake ecology, as well as the control of the growth of Eurasian milfoil by insect herbivory. He's a member and former president of the Northeast Aquatic Plant Management Society, which he has served on the board of directors of and as the editor of the newsletter of. He earned the Society's highest professional award in 2005 and 2017 in recognition of his contributions to understanding the ecology of non-native invasive species Eurasian milfoil and Hydrilla. He presents his scientific findings on aquatic plant studies at regional and national conferences, and he provides training programs to aquatic professionals on aquatic plant identification and of important non-native invasives as well as common native species. He has a Bachelor of Science degree from the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell University. Please welcome Robert Johnson.
Well, that's a little more introduction than I usually get. That I think came from the CLA with a big proposal we were presenting somewhere, so we get a lot more there than I usually get. So thank you. So I'm happy to be here today, and I'm just going to try to go through some things somewhat quickly. I'm not going to be talking a whole lot about species of plants or anything that I usually do. I want to talk about some things that I think we've kind of missed in all of the information and all of the activity that's been out there for the last a couple of years in moving to the point we're at now in the management of the lake. And I'm going to touch upon, see if this works, some of these things up here. And I'm actually going to talk a lot, somewhat about the insects in the lake, which Nancy mentioned, and a little bit about the littoral zone, because as I understand, one of the criteria in determining management will be a certain percentage of the littoral zone or something like that. So I want to hit that a little bit. So as you all know, Chautauqua Lake is a huge, large, shallow lake, very nutrient-rich, very eutrophic, and it has a long history of excessive aquatic plant management and growth. And recently some have been suggesting that there's a silver bullet to helping all this change. And if we listen to Nancy's presentation, it's very complicated everywhere, and things really don't change that much with all the technology and things we've tried, and in many, many years things are not, there is no silver bullet. And then I want to go first to this little quote down here, and I haven't tracked this down, but I got this many years ago from Paul Swanson from the CLA when he was there before he retired, and it was a clipping from a newspaper somewhere, and it was a 1895 clipping of Frank A. Cheney, and he wrote, it was a three-part series, this was his last part, and he wrote in this a very long thing on how the lake was changing so fast and was going to be a swamp soon. And I just took this one quote out, and he said, "Is the lake's lower end turning into a swamp?" And he says, "I think I am safe in saying 100 years from now, what is Burtis Bay will be a swamp." Well, I checked back and looked at his depths of the lakes from Grass Island and out, and they're not too much different than now. And as you can see, we're well over 100 years, going to close to 125, and we still have plenty of water in Burtis Bay. So I wanted to bring that out when we look at the whole thing. And the last thing I want to point out, and I've used this many times before, this was Burtis Bay in the south end in 2006. And that's Eurasian water milfoil at the surface, and if we did our rake toss thing, that would be dense. We don't see that anymore. That's a dense amount of plants, and it's a high biomass. This is what it looked like in 2006. It also probably looked a little bit like this in 2002. So in 2002, we were here and we put a lot of moths, aquatic moths in the lake in December of that year. And at that time, we had Eurasian water milfoil in December at the surface under the ice. So those were our 2 high years in looking at all this over the years. But I want to point out, we haven't seen that again. We haven't seen Eurasian flower at the surface and form mats in this lake since then. And then this is a rough graft of whether there's been a significant change and if we just use our medium density and dense rake toss things, and this is when we toss rakes over and we pull them about 30 feet along the bottom, pull it up, and we evaluate all the plants. And I'll have a slide of that showing when we're doing that. But essentially, if we can't get it into the boat, it's a dense. That means we're getting up and there's a pile of plants coming off the rake and it goes down there, that's dense. A medium is a big armful. And so if you have dense or medium in the lake, that's a fair amount of plants in the lake, and you may have some issues with that depending on what you want to use the lake for. So if we look at that over time, over this span of, I guess this is my other, so I guess what popped up here is not my corrected. I sent this in a day early, but there's not many issues here. But it's actually 17 years now. And so we're going from the medium and dense things here. So at this time we had in the whole lake, looking at our whole plant survey, and right now we're doing 366 locations around the lake and have been doing that for the last 4 or 5 years. So this is looking at whole lake surveys, and we're taking the number of times locations where we have a dense or medium plant thing out of 366. Turns out we're talking about 10% here, and it goes up to maybe 12, 13, and this is probably 12 here. So over that period of time, we don't see any huge increase, and I will submit to you that we put in here, what we don't have in this graph is the years 2002 and 2005, which would be up here somewhere and would make this line go down like this. So we can't argue that plant Eurasian water milfoil has been getting worse and worse and worse year after year in the lake. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. I want to switch now to the littoral zone, and the zone I have here, and the dark area is the shallow areas, and that's the littoral zone. The lighter gray here is the deeper areas of the lake, and the lighter gray for us is not the littoral zone, and it doesn't have any plants. So this is not too different. It's almost exactly what other people would have the littoral zone in Chautauqua Lake look like. If you look at DEC maps or you look at fishing maps, it would be very similar to this. Ours is determined by where we found, many surveys, a piece of a plant. So in this littoral zone here, if we found a little piece that we could hold between our fingers and it was green, we said there were plants there. So that determined where plants grow in the lake, rooted plants mainly, higher plants, macrophytes, that's littoral zone. This is the North Basin, and what I want to sort of argue here is that in my case, we estimated there was a little over 2,000 acres of littoral zone, but I'm saying that probably of that, only 75% has plants that you can see and plants there that have plants growing. The other part of it is either a trace amount, like you pull 30 feet and you find a piece of a plant, or you have nothing. So my point is, if you're using the littoral zone to determine how you treat the lake and the type of management you do, you need to maybe cut this down a little bit and that the littoral zone is actually smaller than what it is. And the reason, I'll get to the reason why I think the littoral zone is extremely important in this lake and the plants are important in a minute. But if we cut this down, and 25% is a trace abundance, we're down from 2,100 acres to 1,600 acres. And if, for example, now there may be some criteria out there, I believe, in determining how much herbicide they use in the lake at a certain area, that percentage, you need to calculate the percentage probably on a lower, smaller littoral zone instead of a larger one. If you calculate it, you may be knocking out, if you use large, you may be knocking out a lot of your aquatic plants in a lot of littoral zone. Jumping to the South Basin, and here we have a much larger littoral zone because if you think of Burtis Bay and Sherman's Bay and Asheville Bay and up in Arnold's Bay, up here we've got a lot of areas that are very shallow, a lot of aquatic plants growing in that area. So we have a much larger littoral zone down here. But again, the same thing pertains to this, because there are areas up in here, for example, which are in the littoral zone that we described, but we're talking about 7 meters of water, so we're talking 20-some feet deep, which there's probably not a whole lot of plant material down there. So in those deep areas, and there's some down here, in this area here, so those are areas that we probably wouldn't want to particularly pick out and say, we need to treat those in some way. You certainly don't treat them with mechanical harvesting because you can't reach it. There aren't going to be plants growing to the surface in 20 feet of water normally in the lake. So I'm saying mainly management decisions should be should consider the lower littoral acreage to avoid limit excessive management. And the other thing I've noticed over the last couple of years, looking at some places that were managed with herbicides, and I have been doing surveys in the spring and fall, and I kind of said, wow, what happened there? Why are we doing it there? Because we didn't find any plants there. So that may have just been an error in picking the location or something, I'm not sure. But those are things that need to be worked out in the future, that we need to kind of more pinpoint the areas that you would want to treat and eliminate things like Eurasian water milfoil and curly pondweed. Certainly areas like this we would not want to target for herbicides. And I want, this area here actually is north of Long Point a little bit. It's an area actually that was targeted for herbicides, but at the last minute some of that area, not this year but the year before, was not used because there actually wasn't any plants there. And so, and if you think about it, because of that shoreline north of Long Point along the east shore is being hit with these winds coming from the northwest, you're going to remove all the plants, as you do in many places around around Chautauqua Lake, because of the high wind, many of these nearshore areas don't have a whole lot of plants. So in the first year or so here, you were targeting 100, 200 feet out with the herbicides, and in some cases there weren't a whole lot of plants there just because of physical activity, wave action, and everything is just removing those plants anyway. So those are just some of the things I noticed out there. And if you think about it, a lot of the docks on Chautauqua are extremely long. There's a lot of 200-foot docks, and if you go around those docks, several places around the lake, we don't see a whole lot of plant growth in there where it's shallow, because in the wintertime the lake is down. If there's wave action in the fall or spring as the ice comes off, it's beating that shoreline area, and it kind of physically removes the plants, and so you don't have a whole lot of material there. And why is this important? So I've used these before in other presentations, but we wanted to talk about the importance of healthy plant growth. And one of my employees that's worked for me about 25 years or more is an artist too, and she had done these paintings of this, and then the top one is sort of our ideal aquatic pond or lake, and we have lots of nice birds on the edge, and we have plants growing out in the lake, and we have clear water. And the other one is where we don't have a lot of plants growing in the lake, and we have a pea soupy green water. Now there's lots of data, lots of scientific papers published out there, lots of theories on alternative states. And so what we're talking about here is a clear state, which is the top one, which is dominated by rooted plants, macrophytes in some cases in the shallow areas, and we have clear water. The bottom one is where we have a lot of these plants are gone, bare bottom, and conditions are not great. There may be low oxygen conditions here. And in this case, plants are removed, and this is what we call a phytoplankton-dominated turbid lake. And the idea here is that there's a balance, and so you can tip either way. You can sort of be in the middle, and Chautauqua's probably in the middle somewhere. And depending on how you manage the lake or things that may happen naturally, this lake can tip either way. And so it could tip to a lake full of aquatic plants, rooted plants, a lot of them, and the water is clear, or you could tip the other way and you become a phytoplankton-dominated lake. Today, and as Nancy mentioned about the issue with cyanobacteria, harmful algae blooms, it appears that today we would be seeing less of the green algae that we saw back in the 60s with eutrophication, and now we're seeing more of the phytoplankton will be cyanobacteria or harmful algae blooms. So this is a pretty precarious position to be. There's lots of data out there, but it seems to be just sort of pushed aside that this is something you need to consider. So the consideration here is that you need the littoral zone, you need aquatic plants. Obviously you don't need Eurasian water milfoil at the surface or clearleaf at the surface impeding types of uses of the lake that some of the stakeholders would like. So again, with just a couple of things, with the loss of rooted aquatic plants from the littoral zone in a large shallow lake like Chautauqua, it increases the wind-driven waves that are hitting the shoreline, stirring up the bottom sediments, eroding the shoreline, and increasing the phosphorus loading to the water column. The preservation of macrophytes and their attached epiphytic community, and this is another thing that I ignore, everybody ignores, that on these aquatic plants that are there, rooted plants, they have lots of other little plants growing on them. All kinds of algae and stuff attached to them, sort of like a parasite kind of thing. They're all attached. Those things are taking up a huge amount of nutrients from the water column, and if you do away with the plants, and certainly you're going to lose that advantage of taking a little bit of the phosphorus and nitrogen out of the water column. So the loss of the active growing macrophytes and the epiphytic communities that can take up the nutrients and block the wind-driven waves can allow more nutrient availability to the water column that can increase more blue-green phytoplankton or cyanobacteria bloom. So it's something to consider. And that's why we need the importance of, gotta go the right way here. So now I want to switch a little bit here. Why has Chautauqua Lake's important aquatic plant growth remained relatively stable? And I'm saying it's stable, and I'm looking at the last several years' data. And then if I look historically back to the 80s, biomass surveys that were done here by scientists and people in Chautauqua County, we don't see a difference in the biomass that's in the lake. Now, everybody in every lake that we go to, that Nancy goes to, aquatic plant weeds are getting worse every year. So every time, I mean, we've been doing this, I've been doing it 40, 50 years maybe, weeds are worse every year. That probably is not the case. So the other thing is, why doesn't water milfoil emerge above the water surface in Chautauqua, form the surface mats each year, as it did in 2006 and 2002, and it does in many lakes. There are many lakes we go to. If we've talked a little bit, Nancy did, about Cazenovia Lake, where we're using herbicides for the last 10 years, and so going back to a little bit of mechanical harvesting now. They've got a harvester there also. They have milfoil come to the surface every year, or they treat, they get good control the year they treat, good control the second year, then the third year it's back at the surface about the same as it was the first year. There we don't have what I'm going to talk about. So there we got flowering plants and matting, and on Cazenovia there are a lot of people that like to sail there, and so if they're out trying to sail with their sailboat, as they do in Chautauqua, and you're hitting this big mass of milfoil, that's a problem. So here we don't see that. We have milfoil down there. We certainly have curly leaf at the surface, and we'll have soon in the lake, around the lake, everywhere that kind of drops out the 1st of July. So the other question is, why has Frank Chaney's 1895 prediction of a swamp in Burtis Bay not happened? There are several reasons, but one of them I'm going to point to. And why does the desirable native plant community remain so stable in Chautauqua? And we have charts in our reports that you can get through the CLA website of the surveys we do each year and the plants over the many years. It's actually staying pretty darn stable for many, many years. And I might suggest several plausible reasons, but one stands out. And that is something we've kind of moved away from here, but this is how I got here in 2002. I had been here, I stopped here actually in 1993 at Prendergast Point. I was out at Findlay Lake giving a talk, and Findlay Lake actually in the past had a very high number of insects. It had a lot of milfoil. It's changed a lot since then. It's changed to other plants and so forth. But they had a tremendous number of weevils in their lake, so we were out there studying those. I stopped at Prendergast Point in 1993, went down to the dock, and there was Elodea there. And Elodea had floated in the shore, and I picked it up, and I looked at it, and the Elodea was crawling with moth caterpillars, a caterpillar we had studied. And so it was crawling all over the Elodea, and I thought, wow, that's something. And then I did some checking with some people at Chautauqua during that period of time, and it turns out during that period of time, Eurasian water milfoil in the lake was actually down, and we were going, well, does that have anything to do with a moth or anything? So I kind of tossed it aside, but in 2002, Paul McHugh of Fisheries called me up and said there's a company, Enviroscience, that wants to introduce weevils into Chautauqua Lake, and they wanted $100,000 to put some weevils in, and Paul wanted to know, what about this? And I said, well, do you have a couple bucks to pay for my gas? I'll come out and check it out. I go out to Chautauqua Lake, and I'm not sure whether it's 2002 or 2001 when I was there, but when I got there, there were literally trillions and trillions of aquatic weevils in Bertus Bay. That's the one we looked at the CLA. So we had all kinds of insects in the bay already. This is the weevil they wanted to introduce. So EnviroScience would have come and taken 100,000, put in 10,000 eggs, which wouldn't have amounted to anything in the end. But they were putting them into a pot that already had trillions in there. So that's something we followed for many years on that. That's how I got here, and then we started working for the CLA in 2002. We introduced some moths. Weevils were never introduced into this lake. They came in naturally. They're your main control of Eurasian water milfoil in this lake as a biocontrol. The aquatic moth was here also. We did introduce several 100,000 into Bertus Bay at that time. On December 27th, there was 27 inches of ice on December 27th in 2002, and we cut through that with cores, and I've got pictures of that, and we put our bags of our caterpillars on milfoil on little weighted bags, and they went to the bottom, mesh bags. So we were hoping that in the spring these guys would come out and wake up and go out and start increasing. Well, what we didn't know, at the same time that year, there was actually a herbicide treatment in Bertus Bay with Aquathol K in a small, narrow area somewhere out near the channel. We were there. We didn't see the effects of anything that happened. We didn't notice that the herbicide had an effect that year. It was a fairly small area, and it probably got diluted out. But in 2003, the next year, we come back and there's no plants. And Bertus Bay doesn't have any plants. They're all gone. Milfoil's all gone. Now, it was quickly claimed that the Aquathol did it, which it couldn't have because of a small thing. Then we could have claimed that our moth did it, but we couldn't figure out where all the plants went to. We thought, oh gosh, we lost 100,000 moths. Well, we went out there and we found our bags. Our moths had left, but found the bags, but they didn't have anything to go get on. So that was kind of a huge bust in our biocontrol. We did introduce some later up in the lake in a couple places, but the moth actually is a resident of the lake anyway, and it naturally can increase on its own. And so what I'm saying here is that there are lots of scientific studies. We have lots of feeding trials on these invertebrate herbivores in New York and around the country. And so I'm saying, therefore, conservation of these insects is important. We want to be sure that management of the lake is done in a way that we don't eliminate a lot of these, because these are saving you lots of money. They are the main control of aquatic macrophyte Eurasian water milfoil in the lake. If you do the mechanical harvesting or do the herbicide spraying along the edges, there's still a lot of macrophytes out much deeper, and these guys are out there sort of keeping it in control. And so they also have figured out how to work around the harvesting mechanism. So even though we have mechanical harvesting, which is removing plants from the lake and removing these insects, they are produced in such high numbers that every year they do their thing. So it's important that we consider those, and if we go to a place like Juanita, Lamoka Lakes, which in the 1990s was some of our highest weevil lakes in the state, they had 10% milfoil in Juanita Lake. But there was a lot of politics involved in why we used the herbicide there in 2003. It had to do with challenges at the Lake George to try to use the herbicide in Lake George, a couple of big court cases or court judicial things that happened there that said they couldn't use it there, so DEC decided Juanita Lake in 2003 would be where we put the Floridone. So we've been involved with that lake since then, but one thing we do not have in Juanita Lake or Lamoka Lake are weevils. There's none there. We don't have too many in Casanova Lake either, but it's not necessarily because of the herbicide use there. It has to do with its fish structure, as Nancy mentioned. The detriment to the weevil are bluegills. And for some reason, Chautauqua Lake has the right fish combination for herbivores, and we don't have a problem here. And so these are the two insects. The weevil is here. This is an adult weevil. The mechanism it does it, this thing lays eggs, and the eggs come out as larvae. They mine into the top tip of Eurasian water milfoil and mine it out, and the top falls off and decays. Eventually the entire plant will decay, but that takes off the growing tip and it stops. That's why we don't see Eurasian water milfoil flowering in Chautauqua Lake. The last several years, we are having 100% of all the plants we sample with our rake toss sampling in the lake have had insect damage to the tip of Eurasian, the whole lake as we go around it. So that's happening out there. You still have lots of Eurasian. It doesn't knock it down. And the moth is another one which stays there all winter long as a caterpillar, comes out and starts eating the plant early in the season, bites off the growing tip, and then produces more moths. They lay eggs in the end of June, more come out. They go through an entire life cycle. In August they send out more. So they're in the lake all the time. They're certainly, in Chautauqua, they're not as important as this plant. In Cayuga Lake, the moth is really the mechanism that keeps Eurasian pretty well in control. And I just want to talk about, there are many lakes found in Chautauqua on water milfoil, and we've seen some of our greatest, highest insect densities of these herbivores in 2018. So last year, around the lake, we had off the charts with weevils and moths. Even at the bell tower, where we are in fairly deep water there, we have not seen weevils for a long time. We suspected it was the fish there that were in the macrophytes that take them. We were extremely high there. So these guys are all over the place in the lake doing their thing. Down here we have the milfoil midge, which is Cricketopus, and this is in most of our lakes, and this damages the tip by eating and chewing at it, and it turns red. This is the larvae of the weevil. This is important. This is a caddis, which we've talked about here before. This is in Chautauqua Lake. This is Necasecti albidii. It's a ghost caddis. Been here, a native, a long time. This is a milfoil from an Adirondack lake. This is the milfoil from Chautauqua at the same time. So what's happening there, these guys just eat off all the leaflets, and we see that everywhere. Down here is an adult female moth laying hundreds of eggs, these little golden things on milfoil. So these are acknowledged, these three biological controlled agents for Eurasian water milfoil. It's out there in the literature. There are mixed, as Nancy mentioned, in some lakes it doesn't work, and it probably has a whole lot to do with the fish population and bluegills. But these are well established. This is the ghost caddis that you have here, and this is in Chautauqua Lake. This is one of our rake toss trays here, and in the hand of the person here are 25 or 30 of these caddis in their cone. They're here, and this guy's got a handful of them. This is on a pile of plants only this big. Put it in there. So that's the number. So if you can imagine, this is in, if you think about the south end of the lake, 800 acres. That's, if they're everywhere or around there on aquatic plants, there's a lot of insects there. This is Eurasian water milfoil. This is after the caddis. That we find this a lot of places in the lake later in the year. They've stripped all the leaves off of the plant. And again, over here are some other ones, and this is an adult caddis here. So they're extremely effective. It's a generalist. This will eat other plants. So in the late fall, we find this eating the native plants. When it runs out of milfoil or something, or it may switch to some other plants, it's out there. So the important thing is, this one we kind of want to keep around somewhere in the lake. So we want to have some safe refuges for these things. They need some shoreline that's not developed, mainly some trees where they can go on when they pupate, and then they emerge as adults and lay eggs. At that point, they need to have some shoreline where they can get on some trees and rest for a while, and then they mate, go out and lay their eggs. And this is one that's been around a long time. Jan Bowman, who's here at the community college, and one of her students back in 2007 was doing a project with us, and they found this caddis out there, reported it in the list, and we reported it. We had a couple of different names for it. It turns out the taxonomy is a little weird with it. There are lots of different names. But for the last 2 years, we're seeing a high concentration of these in some places in the lake. So if we look at this one, south of Maple Springs to Long Point, this caddis in 2018 had stripped the milfoil to this point. It's a much smaller caddis. It's only at the most ½ an inch long in the cone, but this is the kind of damage. This is plants from the area south of Maple Springs. This is from another lake. So these guys are out there doing it. This spring, in our survey at Maple Springs, again in that area down to Long Point Park, we had lots of these things, and samples we took there to evaluate the weevils and moths densities on a little tip that's 12 inches long. Say we have 5 to 6 of these little caddis on it this year. Now these are going to they're pupating now. They're going to come out, emerge, and lay eggs. But there's a lot of them out there. The concentration is high. So this is quickly, we've done a lot of work in the lake on the life cycle of these things. I just want to point this out. We have data out there. This is from Chautauqua Lake showing different locations in the lake where we have high concentrations over many, many years and other things. This is at Mayville down here. This is Camp Merce. And Whitney Bay is probably the place where we had the most weevils. We don't have any there now because there's no Eurasian water milfoil in Whitney Bay. So we're looking at that. And so a typical rake toss in 2019 this spring, I want to point out these are the plants that are out there. This is Eurasian water milfoil here. This is crisp curly-leaf pondweed. This is a Potamogeton perfoliata. This is Potamogeton pralongus. Coontail here, some elodea here, water stargrass, some vallisneria. So we got a wide variety from our single. This is a single rake toss. And the point here is I want to point out we are depressed a little bit in Eurasian water milfoil in the lake this year, not as much now. It may have something to do with spring. And curly-leaf is out there. It's pretty dense in places that it normally grows. But in this particular area, we got lots of plants. But this is a shot from one of the CLA's harvests in the past. Elodea is a native here. It's your most abundant aquatic plant. If you go to the CLA in the middle of summer, what's in all the trucks? A lot of Elodea. And so our rake toss method has been used in Chautauqua since 2003 and is designed to assess long-term changes in the aquatic plant community. And it's to follow at-risk species such as Potamogeton hillei, which we're finding a lot of it here, which the taxonomist that knows a lot in the eastern part of the United States never thought it would be out here. We're now seeing quite a bit of it. And so we kind of do this to evaluate the insect herbivory that's here and also mechanical harvesting in the lake. And I just want to touch on one last thing before my last slide. And I had noticed it's in the newspapers and in the environmental impact statements and everything about the idea that applying herbicides early will have a minimal effect on native species. Now, the herbicides you're applying, Aquathol K and Navigate 2,4-D, these are the native species that are targeted by that herbicide. Targeted means that they're used to kill it. So the point is I want to make all of these species, they were in that tray, all these species are growing really great before May 15th. They're out in the lake. They'll be affected, and you just have to acknowledge that. I mean, we can't say that you're going to treat Eurasian water milfoil and curly before the other plants come up there, because that doesn't work. These other plants are there. They're going like gangbusters. They're very out there. So I just want to make sure in Chautauqua Lake that you realize that they're planting, and if you're spraying on a certain thing, aquathol mainly targets pondweeds or potamogetans. That's what it's used for. So when you're using aquathol, you're going to take out a lot of these plants in the areas where you're using it. So I just think that needs to be acknowledged. And last, I want to just put in one plug for something I do here kind of routinely, and to the watershed people, to John and so forth. This is the watershed sort of at the edge of the lake. And this is taking it back. Are we going to take Chautauqua Lake back to an Adirondack lake like Nancy had suggested on some other lakes? This is water willows, common name, Justicia americana. It's in Chautauqua Lake. If you go to the areas where this is growing, you'll see the most fantastic habitat, the clearest water, and it does some really extremely important things in the lake. It may interfere maybe with a few recreational things, but it only grows in half a foot of water. But it cuts down on the tremendous waves, that action that's eroding the shoreline. The best stands are at the top part of the upper DeWittville Bay, around some houses there where they have kind of cultivated it. Tremendous stands there. When the waves coming from the south hit that, they stop. And so you can go into that area and it's as calm as can be, and we can have whitecaps on Chautauqua Lake. So the part here is that this is a fantastic habitat for invertebrates, for fish, for everything, but it also would really do a lot to help shoreline erosion and maybe cut down the phosphorus a little bit. So that's the end of my talk.